So not only do you get your religious group to expel the people you if you are these gatekeepers want expelled, but you get to that they will then make the argument for you for why that was the right thing to do. So you don't even have to really make the argument in rational terms. You just make the argument in disgust terms, create a sense of disgust, point it at the community you want it pointed at, and then your larger community will make the argument for itself about why that scapegoating was the right thing to do, right? And we see this in Girard's observation that after the expulsion, the community will often congratulate itself, and also they might even valorize the group that they scapegoated, saying, well, they dealt with it well, or come up with something else. But the fact of the matter is that the expulsion has already happened.
Well, Billy, Paul, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on here. I'm ready. I'm so ready to dive into this book, but just thank you both for taking time. It took a little bit because we are all over the country, literally. Billy, you're up there in the New England. Paul, you're over in like Seattle, right?
Yep.
Area.
Yep.
I'm down here in Florida. But we got it, and I'm excited to talk. So thank you both.
Oh, no, thanks for having us.
So your book is about. It's such a unique blend of all of these different ideas, right? You've got theology, you've got psychology, you've got personal storytelling. Can you all, and I don't know if Billy, if you want to start, but can you all just kind of describe that moment when you recognized or realized, or maybe even just kind of discovered that the idea of disgust or the psychology of disgust was kind of that missing link with your experience in evangelicalism?
Yeah, I would say I think I have to say that it was a sort of dawning realization for us. I often say that like the origin for this book goes back to like these hour-long conversations that Paul and I would have on the phone. I had a long commute back then. I used to teach further away from my home than I do now, and so we would have these like weekly or multiple times a week conversations while I was driving home, just talking through whatever we were reading and so forth. And we started reading a little bit on, I think it actually started with Jonathan Haidt's old book. Oh, which one was that one, Paul?
The Righteous Mind.
Moral Foundation. Righteous Mind, yeah. Moral Foundations. And I think I was asking Paul to like give me some kind of justification for disgust as a thing. Like, why is it even, what's it good for at all? And so we were sort of talking about that a little bit. That led to reading Richard Beck's Unclean, talking about that together. And like the more we just sat with this like emotion, affect that we were trying to find a place for, the larger a role we started noticing it playing in these different parts of our lives, right? Sort of in politics, but then also in like our social lives and then in our theology. And then Paul and I are both kind of, this is what, maybe 6-8 years ago. So kind of at that era in the development of like progressive evangelicalism, then progressive Christianity and post-evangelicalism. And kind of, we kept seeing that it was popping up again and again and again as this driving factor, and that dynamic didn't seem to be being discussed as much as we thought maybe it merited. And so that led to more research, and then that led to a couple of papers, and then those were well received. And so that leads to a book, is sort of the genesis of this whole thing.
Now, Paul, for those that don't know you actually work in psychology, correct?
Yeah, I'm a mental health counselor, so I do psychotherapy. I'm also an associate professor of counseling psychology, so I teach in a master's program. So I teach master's level students to become therapists.
So when you two were talking, and Billy, I'm assuming you're coming at it from like a theological perspective, and then Paul, you're coming at it from more of this psychological perspective. I'm picturing those drives homes those drives back home. They were not like, hey, what's going on? Did you catch the Mets game? I mean,
yeah, we're nerds. So, it was,
Yeah.
hey, how's it going? How's the family? So I've been really concerned. Like you were trying to explain Leconomy earlier, and I'm not sure I totally have my head around the real yet. So can you distinguish one more time for me between the real and the imaginary? And then what does that have to do with disgust? I mean, sort of, 2 minutes of small talk is a justification to get into like nerding out about theology and psychology.
so
That's
Paul,
basically what family reunions for us are like as
oh,
well.
I believe that. I believe that. I do. So, Paul, let me ask you this. you all in your book, you draw these powerful connections between disgust and things like the way that the church, evangelicalism, however you want to word it, kind of handles things like sin and purity. Um, I'm honestly curious. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I grew up in that world. I grew up in the fundamentalist church, went to college in that, pastored in that stuff. So like those things like really resonated with me. I'm curious from a psychological point of view. I don't know if the word is how or why. Do you know what I'm getting at? Like how is it weaponized? Why is it weaponized like that? Why disgust?
That's a good question.
Yeah, how much time we got? So there's a lot there. I think I'll start with, and I don't think this is in the book, but there's a little joke I like to tell to sort of look at the way like theology and psychology interact with each other, which is to say, like, theologians tell us how God made humans in God's image. Psychologists then tell us how we've been returning the favor constantly. And that kind of what I mean by that is that the sense that like we can't help but see ourselves when we imagine the divine, when we imagine God, when we think about this spiritual. And so, as kind of a psychoanalytic thinker, I'm constantly curious about not just what are our beliefs, but what's the function of our beliefs? Like, what purpose are they serving? And so it's sort of even going back to Freud's critique of religion wasn't that he had this hard, like proof that there is no God, as much as he was always concerned that like, hey, the belief in God is doing something for you. Like it's also serving this purpose. It has a psychological function. Can we be curious about that? Which is a really separate question from either whether or not God exists or
Mm.
insists or sort of all of those sort of other ways we can think about it. So that's always been kind of my perspective is kind of moving away from maybe what actually like, is out there and more like, hey, on an individual level, what's the function of this doing for you? And so disgust is fascinating because disgust is this emotion that actually is what helps create a sense of self, right? There's a me in the world because there's a not me in the world. There's a sense of separateness, distinction. And disgust, as we talk about, is sort of what mediates that. And so sin, purity, and righteousness are all of these kind of, if we want to think like pre-modern ideas, they come about prior to our understanding of germs and other kind of like not things you can't sense with your five senses. And actually, that's where disgust had been there. Disgust protects you from things that you can't make sense of, that your senses can't pick up, right? In a world before microscopes, we had no idea about germs. So illness might as well have been mystical.
Mm.
In the same way, sin and many of our sort of spiritual or religious understandings were mediated through this lens of disgust, because that was the way we had kind of developed to make sense of things we can't understand with our five senses. And so that was sort of the inroad for me in beginning to be curious about like, okay, um, there's a lot theologically, and Billie has great thoughts, and we build a lot on this. So sort of theologically, what may be true about sin, about that. But for me, I was really curious. Hey, believing that there's a sinful nature, believing that sin is out there, believing, acting as if sin is this contaminant, that functions for a particular way to create a sense of self and your ego and your way of being in the world. And what we noticed is that disgust is a really powerful way to create a sense of group cohesion. Um,
Mm.
being that it's sort of the like um, the misuse of that desire to belong is disgust. You stigmatize an other in order to feel like you belong better. If we can point out how bad those or ugly or disgusting or gross they are, then we can feel better about our sense of connection here. And I started noticing how much that kind of language and that kind of way of forming belonging and community was involved in sort of evangelicalism, but is involved in, I mean, all sorts of connections. We poke a lot on evangelicalism because we're kind of, that's where we come from. So we understand that we can kind of speak to our own culture, but not to say that it's unique to there. I don't know if I missed the point of your
No,
question, but
no.
I was where my
Well, let
mind
me
was going.
ask this, and Billy, feel free to jump in too, because when you were talking about that, it sounds a lot like, um, and I don't know if I made this connection while I was reading it, but as you were talking about it, just kind of popped in my head. A lot of what you said kind of is parallel with uh scapegoating theory,
Hmm.
like
Yeah,
Gerard and
Gerard.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, just from maybe a theological, but also a psychoanalyst perspective, is disgust the mechanism in which scapegoating begins to take place?
I'll jump in on that one. I would say that disgust is pretty critical to the scapegoating process, especially I'll be using sort of a Girardian framework for this one, right? So Girard and the creation of the scapegoat, and I kind of like a lot of what he does with how Jesus unpacks and sort of inverts the scapegoating mechanism, or at least unveils it. Um, So in that scapegoating mechanism, right, where the community is feeling massively unbalanced, it's feeling sort of under attack, it's feeling all this internal tension, and it needs to vent that tension onto some scapegoated group, right? It needs to scapegoat in order to then that creates that cohesion, right? So we actually see this as pretty blatantly parallel. In fact, sort of, I would say it's using the dynamics of disgust in that sense of identifying something that can't be allowed to be here, right? So the group is potentially even aware, like really aware of a something that is genuinely threatening or harmful to the group, but that it's having trouble with getting rid of, right? So one of the things I would point to right now as a good example would be how frequently we see the church dealing with sexual abuse scandals within the church, right? It feels like these days, I mean, you can't open the internet, or social media without seeing some other youth pastor who's just pled guilty to something really heinous, right? So when a community is feeling that sense of disease and unbalance, and their whole identity is sort of up in the air and being challenged, that's going to create a sense of corporate collective disgust, and something needs to be got rid of, right? Like imagine the feeling of being, when you feel nauseous and you have this sense, right? You have the thought that if I could just throw up, I would feel better, right? Like I would get resolution, right? And so when you translate this to this corporate level, that sense of I need to do this violent expulsion. Why? Well, because in past moments, violent expulsion has successfully made me feel better, right? And then the turn that ends up happening, right, is that these power players, the gatekeepers of evangelicalism, this has been my experience very much as a queer Christian, right? Um, Work really hard to focus that sense of disease, that nausea, onto whatever target they want ejected. Whoever it is they have decided is the heretic of the moment, is the scapegoat of the moment, right? That's where the propaganda comes in, that is specifically focused on getting the community to experience that group as disgusting, i.e., as the source of their nausea, and then violently eject them as quickly as possible, which serves the double purpose to these gatekeepers of actually the triple purpose of reinforcing their role as gatekeeper, right? So they were the ones who identified the problem. They get to call themselves prophetic or whatever other people call them that, and they love that feeling. They get that the group cohesion comes back, so they don't have to actually get rid of the people who were actually the problem, right? We would suggest that certain teachings around moral purity and sexuality have been a problem for the evangelical church for a while, but all right, so they get to avoid the actual problem, and they get rid of the people that they didn't like, that they wanted out. On top of all of that, you have the problem that disgust, and Paul talks about this really effectively. I'll give way to him here in a second, right? But the disgust operates, it justifies itself after the fact, but it tells itself the story that it was being reasonable, right? So just disgust works with post hoc justification. It's not rational. You don't have time to rationalize, should I or should I not spit out this rotten flavor in my mouth? You have to do it. Like the urge happens before anything else. You might, if you have a lot of self-control, hold back the actual spitting out, but that urge is there and it's strong. It's overpowering very, very early on. After you've done the expulsion, you tell yourself a story about why that was the right thing to do, and justification is very, very powerful, right? So not only do you get your religious group to expel the people you if you are these gatekeepers want expelled, but you get to that they will then make the argument for you for why that was the right thing to do. So you don't even have to really make the argument in rational terms. You just make the argument in disgust terms, create a sense of disgust, point it at the community you want it pointed at, and then your larger community will make the argument for itself about why that scapegoating was the right thing to do, right? And we see this in Girard's observation that after the expulsion, the community will often congratulate itself, and also they might even valorize the group that they scapegoated, saying, well, they dealt with it well, or come up with something else. But the fact of the matter is that the expulsion has already happened.
Paul, you got anything?
Yeah, no, just to kind of harp on that like um, post hoc thing that Billy was mentioning,
Mhm.
right? That we this is part, again maybe one part of why I like Disgust so much is that um, fear, and I'm going to be overly simplistic, so others who study emotions bear with me for a second. But in many ways, if we distinguish fear and disgust, they're both protective emotions. But fear is something that I would argue as a culture in the US we have a much easier time like living with. Like I can acknowledge that I'm afraid of a threat. And so that we need to be wise and we need to actually take care of risk. And there's a lot of ways that fear lives in our culture in a way that we can manage. But we act as if we're not supposed to be disgusted by people. Like I can fear you, but I'm not supposed to be disgusted by you, and that because that can cause a problem. And so instead, we tell our stories. Like our post talk is usually fear. The problem is fear can be rationalized and reasoned with, right? If driving a car is dangerous, but putting on a seatbelt, following the laws, getting a license, learning how to do it minimizes that risk. So I can do it anyway. Disgust doesn't operate the same way. You can't reason your way into not being disgusted by something. Because what's interesting about disgust is it's actually less about the object of disgust and more about the one being disgusted,
Hmm.
which again is why two of us would look at the same thing and one of us would be disgusted and the other one would be fine with it. It's not about the object, it's actually about what that object means to each of us.
That's interesting. That we could go off on a rabbit hole on that one. Hey, look at that squirrel. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Well, in one part of the book, and you touched on it earlier, in one part of the book, you talk about how disgust protects the ego.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I'd like to park there for just a second. You kind of said it helps draw a line between me and not me, right? Like, and you even mentioned that a moment ago. So how do you see that showing up? And I think it's so on the nose right now because as we're recording this, and this episode will come out fairly quickly, but as we're recording this, Shiny Happy People 2, season 2 has just come out, talking about teen mania and all of the stuff that was wrapped up in like Acquire the Fire and all of the adjacent things. Like I didn't do Acquire the Fire, but I was a youth minister then, and we used some of his videos. I can remember him, how do you say his last name? What is it?
Loose, I think.
Lose. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Who cares? But you talk about that showing up in like purity culture and around gender and sexuality. How do you see this idea of disgust of protecting the ego really showing up in kind of that purity culture?
So here, I'll start, Billy, and I'll let you jump in with more of the purity culture kind of sociology side. So what's fascinating on an individual level psychologically is when we say ego, we're talking about a sense of self, a conscious, like
Mhm.
the image of me that I carry around. And we use that word image on purpose because it's the you see when you look in a mirror. Essentially, it's kind of, and psychoanalytically, the theorist talks about kind of come from the mirror stage, which means it's you from the outside. And it's an image of you as whole and coherent, but it's not the full you. There's always more to us that can't be captured in that picture. And when I teach on this, I kind of talk about how like every object is a three-dimensional object. You can never see all sides of it at the same time. There's always another side to it. Whatever image you have of my cup, there's another side to it that you can't ever see at the same time as the other, right? And so there's always something left out. And so whatever image I have of myself, whatever ego I carry around, which is a necessary thing, egos by themselves aren't bad, but they're incomplete. They're a misrecognition, is what the Lacan calls it. The problem is when we buy so much into that ego, then we double down on protecting an image against reality, against the fullness of who we are. So I think in one of the chapters we talk about that common thing that comes after some horrific sort of bullying incident or thing or some other horrific tragedy. You often get the line, "This isn't who we are," which I think is such a fascinating line because actually that line comes about right after we just proved that's exactly who we are. We
Mm-hmm.
just did that. But that line, "this isn't who we are," actually subtly works to say because the person that did it wasn't really one of us, right? And is now this kind of expulsion thing to try to protect an image of who we want to see instead of grieving or facing the reality of who we actually are. We see this all over the place. And so that's disgust at play. It's that this reality, this piece of the real that is actually a part of me, I can't fit that into my image. So I'm going to project it out. I'm going to expel it. I'm going to buy into a fantasy of who I wish I was over the reality of who I am.
So then that plays into, I mean, that plays into all kinds of stuff historically and within America. I mean,
Absolutely.
Billy, you brought it up earlier talking about you can't open up Instagram without seeing the mugshot of a youth pastor or pastor, right? And then it's like, but the calls coming from inside the house. And it has been for so long, and yet nothing's ever done about it.
No, well, what's done about it is that other groups are scapegoated and got rid of, right? Again, it's that no, it does create a sense of nausea. It creates a sense of disease. You see too many, if you dis-ease, by the way, they're not disease, right? But if you are a good Christian evangelical person, Christian person generally, and you keep seeing pastors being found guilty of doing this kind of thing, or if you hear a little bit of chatter in your church about how some people aren't really very comfortable with so and so, that's not comfortable because that's not the story we want to tell ourselves about the church and who the church is, whether that's our local community, like our local body of Christ church, or the church universal. Either way, that's not what this that's not part of the story we're willing to tell ourselves, right? That is a contradiction. It sits uneasily with the sort of collective ego, and I'm butchering a little bit. The sociologist in me is going to make the psychologist cringe, but right, like the sort of collective ego of the church is there's a problem there that creates a tension. So we do get rid of people. It's just that we don't get rid of the people who are the problem because they also hold power. All right. And because actually getting rid of them would force us to confront, would require that we confront the actual cause. This is why in the book we actually do get into, I think maybe it's one of the less comfortable chapters, but we talk about some of the importance of shame. We talk about the importance of being willing to sit with that dissonance between who we want to think of ourselves as and who the evidence says we actually are, and being willing to actually say, okay, I need to accept this shameful imagination of myself because it is only once I've accepted that that I can begin to change, that I can outgrow that. And this is something that now I'm rabbit trailing off a rabbit trail, but I'm going to finish this thought, right? This is something that I would say that we in the queer community are really familiar with. When you hear queer people talking about the importance of unpacking our internalized homophobia or transphobia or queerphobia, right? We are aware that the only way to move forward as healthy people is to recognize the fact that we have been formed, that we have been shaped to be queerphobic by these queerphobic society that we live in, and that we need to integrate that, process it, and grieve it, and then move past it. And then that's the only way into health for us. And I would say that the same thing holds true for the church. The same thing holds true for our country, right? I mean, we're seeing all kinds of messaging right now around that is geared at trying to deny the ugly reality of who we are and how we were shaped and what our country really is like. And I would say, and again, I you know I want to be gentle, but I want to say this goes back through multiple administrations, right? Of Democrats don't like are sort of famously supposed to be the ones that are okay with changing the names of forts and of taking down Confederate monuments, and I'm also in favor of those things. But when that is accompanied by a statement of this is not who we are, rather than the statement, this has shaped us and we have to reshape ourselves. We have to grieve that, we have to acknowledge that, and we have to move forward in the recognition of our complicity in the fact that, racism is America's national, original sin, in the fact that we are a country built on the genocide of Native Americans. We have to begin with that recognition and by incorporating that into who we are, rather than these sort of get rid of the evidence of it and say it's bad and then deny that that is part of who we are.
That will preach. I have often argued some of that stuff myself, the idea that no, this is exactly who we are. This is who we've always been. Why do we keep saying that? But it makes so much sense, uh, Paul, when you were talking about like, no, this is who we are, and yet, oh wait, oh, but we're also these things. It made me think of when you were talking. It made me think of Richard Rohr, how he talks about the ego, like the first and second halves of our lives, and kind of like that unchecked ego, and all those things, like the shadow parts, and one of the things that I've discovered, and maybe this plays into it a little bit, but one of the things I've discovered is that when we start actually addressing those things, um, I don't know if it's maybe it's shame kind of disappears, and all of a sudden those aren't those things that were once shameful are no longer shameful,
Mhm.
and now like Billy, you kind of mentioned it within kind of internalized homophobia and those kinds of things. um once you're able to like shine a light on those things and like you said, sit in that, then there's a wholeness that would not have occurred otherwise. And I'm curious if you're looking at it from last question on this, and then I want to jump into the Eucontamination, the Jesus, and like the not to just move past the gross or whatever, but I don't want to spend the whole time there.
Sure.
Um, but collectively as a church or even as a country, I guess from your point of view that nothing will ever change until we stop and say, no, no, no. Well, Bill, you just brought it up. Like, no, this country was founded in genocide.
Mhm.
And if you really want to jump into it, I mean, didn't Jesus say you reap what you sow? You know, the fruit of a tree, you know, all of those things just keep popcorning up in my head.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we are going to just keep putting different sets of clothes over the wound, rather than actually letting it heal. As Mark Charles, whom we cite in the book, I remember talks about the problem of talking about reconciliation, racial reconciliation, when there was never any original state of unity to begin with. And he always recommends that we just talk about conciliation because there's no re involved there, right? Like, and so even the framing of like trying to move forward as reconciliation rather than conciliation, is designed, hopefully unintentionally, but is designed to help us pretend that the rot does not go as deep as it does. And I think one of the things we often run into is that we are not comfortable with the idea that things can be imperfect, even rightly described as shameful, and that doesn't make the person somebody that we should give up on. And even if that person is us, it doesn't even mean necessarily that the institution or the group is or the community is something we should give up on. It means that it needs a lot of work, and that healing comes through recognizing the core problems and then growing past, grieving them, making restitution, and moving and growing past and through them. But the problem is that, I mean, the difficulty, I don't want to say the problem, but the difficulty is that all the time we're doing that, there is always just off to the side, there's always an off ramp. It's you never move past the off ramp and say, okay, we dealt with that temptation, it's behind us, and now we're going to move forward. There's always the possibility of turning off and saying, well, we've done it, it's okay now, instead of working all the way through it. There's always the temptation to just stop. It gets uncomfortable. Let's turn away. Let's not look at it.
Yeah, I mean, the way I always want to frame it as a therapist is sort of, right. Patients often come to me, they seek help because they have a symptom. They're depressed, they're anxious, and they want their depression or their anxiety to go away. And I think that's great. But if therapy is purely making you feel the discomfort less, then that's turning medicine into just relieving pain, as opposed to actually trying to deal with a disease. And um, sometimes we actually have to, well, actually, most therapies offer some form of integrating into that, like actually that anxiety, that depression is because there's some aspect of you that keeps trying to push in that you're resisting. And the symptom of that is depression, anxiety, and that there's a level of being able to tolerate that in order to move forward. The example I sometimes teach with that is sort of like if I have a headache, I can take an aspirin and the headache will go away, but that won't do anything for why I had a headache, for my dehydration that's causing a headache. But my symptom of the headache will be gone. And I think so much of what we're talking about here is this idea of like I just want to make the signs of it, I want to make the reminders go away. So I can live as if I'm not dehydrated. I can live as if I'm the image of who I am. I'd rather pick the image over the real. And I think time and again, humans will pick the comfort of the image over the discomfort of the real. There's a Carl Rogers was kind of a famous psychologist who I'm going to butcher his quote, but if I can, one of the things he says is something along the lines of, "It's not until we can accept ourselves the way we are that we're actually able to change." And I think that's
Yeah.
just such a beautiful
I
image of
mean,
like,
that
yeah, we
was,
have to be willing to face the reality of who we are. And that's going to mean contending with our disgust, which is visceral. I mean, it's embodied. It's not just a conscious, oh yeah, I acknowledge that bad things happened, but I have to actually allow it to feel and work its way through me.
when
I gotta
I
say,
was just want to say, when I went first started therapy, I started therapy and the my presenting issues where I was angry all the time, and I had stopped feeling other negative emotions. And so we did all this work to help me feel negative emotions again. This led to me coming out as trans ultimately, right? But that's the thing, is that my therapist mercilessly brought me back to what is the experience you are feeling in your body. And by the time there was no denying that what it is I am profoundly sad at not being able to live as who I am. I am deeply sad about that. Then at that point, well, the only way forward becomes really clear. But I had built up so many ways of trying to stop from seeing that. And if my therapist had been willing to go along with me and just say, okay, well, if we can do this, that, or the other, the symptoms of your anger and your sadness might stop. Well, I would never have. They would have just come back in the end, right? It would only have gotten worse another 4, 5, 10 years down the road. I needed to confront what was actually the cause of what was making me, what was causing all these problems.
And I don't want to go off on this rabbit trail because I'm going to ask this next question, but you and I have talked about this before. I think what you just said is one of the driving reasons behind all of the transphobic, all of the attacks on the on trans community coming from this very hyper masculine, hierarchical, patriarchal system within the church, because of that healing work that you had to do. And then all of a sudden that hyper masculine side is reminded of like, no, no, no. Yes, there is a masculine side, but oh, look over here too. There's this side, and they don't want to wait. I'm alpha. I'm not beta,
Yeah.
but I don't want to go down that trail. But Paul,
If I get just one part, I know, and this is
do it.
something in the book, but like the story of David being confronted by Nathan, I think is just such a wonderful example of this. Like David rapes Bathsheba, he murders her husband. Nathan comes in, tells him this story, and David's reaction is just over the top at this story. Like, oh, that man who stole the sheep, like he needs to die. That's projective disgust. That's exactly what you're talking about this part of David that he didn't want to face about himself. He was desperate to crush it outside of him in a vain attempt to crush it within himself because of what he felt internally. And it was Nathan being able to say, no, you are that man, that actually broke through to allow David to actually face what he'd done, at least to some extent. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, right? All of this vitriol and all of this like transphobic rhetoric comes from an inability to see exactly what like this is projective disgust within themselves that they're then projecting onto the trans community.
And you brought that up, but I had never thought about it like that before. I mean, like not in
Mhm.
those terms. Like I had thought about like, okay, he's feeling guilty, right? And so
Yeah.
like I'm gonna relieve or whatever, but never to quite the depth that you all. Yeah, I found that fascinating. It was like one of those aha moments, something switches. You're like, oh, I'm not gonna see that the same way again.
Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to jump into Eucontamination. Did I say that
Yeah.
correctly?
Yes, you
Yes.
got it.
Okay, good. I did. Great. Eucontamination, contamination for good. And it's should I use the word striking reversal of evangelical logic? I mean, I think that's correct. How in the world did y'all come up with this idea?
Well, I'll go back to what Billy says. We're nerds, and uh, and I mean, so it comes from, I mean, realizing that the logic of disgust, you do see that like play out, but that Jesus does something incredible in this inversion with how disgust actually operates, with how contamination operates, with what's powerful and what's fragile. The logic still stays the same in terms of how things work, but Jesus inverts what's powerful and what's fragile in these fascinating ways. And so we kept talking about it, and we had to, and just trying to talk about it, we would use sentences to like get to the subject of the one sentence we were trying to say. And so we realized we needed a way to talk about this contamination that was actually working in a way that was good. And so I think I give credit to Billy being the Tolkien scholar among us to build off of eucatastrophe
Mhm.
and this idea of that catastrophic moment that's actually the moment of salvation, as this sort of contamination, where this contamination that actually is the very thing that saves us.
Yeah, no, I think that sort of is the origin of it. It really was a lot of like sitting with it, and we're wrestling, we're like talking and arguing with each other and trying to figure out what is going on with disgust and what's going on with Jesus in the Gospels. And Jesus, because it struck us pretty early on that Jesus doesn't seem subject to the same sort of disgust thinking that a lot of people we were seeing with, a lot of these problematic behaviors that we were recognizing in the world, that Jesus doesn't seem to sort of jab with that. But the more we pushed on that, the more it became evident that not only does Jesus like not play that game, he's sort of completely reversing it, right? He sort of accepts that the logic, what we call the logic of disgust, the kind of way disgust works, has some validity to it. But he says, but here's the thing: holiness is a contaminant, right? So what is powerful is what is good, what is love, life, the way of Christ. These are actually so powerful that if you let them in, they will transform you. And oh, by the way, your resistance to letting those things into you are well described by the logic of disgust, by the psychology of disgust. And it is in overcoming that and letting that come in and transform you that we actually get access to the life and the way and the truth of Christ, that Jesus is bringing. So when
Well,
we realize that it's not just a rejection, right? That's sort of one thing you could do. You'd be like, that is bad, don't do it. But instead, Jesus is kind of 180ing the whole thing. That we realize we need a new word. We need a word for this thing that Jesus is doing. And that's, so that led to eucontamination and what we're talking about here.
so then if we're looking at it from the lens that you all are talking about in the book, um, then that means that like our call changes. I mean, if you want to use that language, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
what it means to follow the way of Jesus, that kind of changes that idea.
It's a whole posture change is the way I like to describe it. Like instead of your faith being like a football that you're trying to like hold and carry to the end zone without somebody ripping it out of your hands, or that you just like need to like death grip on, and like the fear is that it's somehow you're going to lose it, right? It changes from that where the world is out to get you and you need to protect yourself from it to actually suddenly your faith is a contaminant, that love is a contaminant within the world. And so instead of being afraid that you're going to lose your faith, it's actually like go out, go spend time with other, allow yourself to contaminate the world and allow your faith to be contaminated, because greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world, because love actually is the more powerful thing. So like, I mean, the striking thing about disgust is you sort of, if you have a glass of water, right, that's sort of a drinking water, is pure, and if I were to spit in it, you're not going to ask how much spit, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a ridiculous any spit. And in fact, even the thought that you spat in is probably going to be enough for me to throw it away. What typically while we operate thinking that like, oh, my holiness, my faith is this pure thing that needs to be protected from the spit of the world, Jesus walks around saying, no, no, we're the spit. Love, I am the spit. I am that which contaminates this world. And the spit isn't afraid of the drinking water. It's the other way around.
So you're saying that Jesus is holy spit.
Oh, Jesus absolutely holy spit.
I
Jesus holy
think I think
spat on a guy. Remember, there's
yeah,
all
I mean,
sorts of that.
Oh yeah,
literally,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I think our first article on this ended with "We are the poop." I think is what actually ended with, just to push it a little bit.
You get to say fun things when you're a scholar of disgust.
Oh, that should be a t-shirt. We are the poop. That's funny. You guys are the brownies. We're the poop.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's so
And
funny.
this is the thing is I really like what Paul talks about apostleship, right? Because it's this stance that, and it doesn't say like, I have everything good and perfect that you need, right? Like that's that kind of very missionary approach that we would still have some problems with, right? Instead, it's this open posture of invitation with the confidence that what is good in you will benefit what's in me, and what's good in me will benefit what's in you. That actually it's in that space between us in our meeting that if what is good and holy and right and true and of God is the spit, if it's the more powerful thing, then in an interaction between us where we're both open to one another and open to whatever the divine is doing between us, we will both walk away changed for the better, right? And that is a completely different problem. I remember growing up evangelical and having that football approach, right? This idea of like,
Mm.
each time I interact with a non-believer, I have to make sure that I can escape that conversation with my faith intact, right? Instead of being able to go into friendships and conversations wondering with open curiosity, what does this person have that's good for me? And hoping that I have something that's good for them and that we will both be enriched from our interaction with one another.
I think about the Syrophoenician woman. Um, you know, for those that don't know, where this Jesus has this encounter with this woman and she's not part of his tribe and she asks for healing and he's like, "No, I came for, the Jewish people, my people, and do I give, the food to the dogs?" And she's like, "Yeah, but even dogs get scraps from the master's table." And he was like, "Oh crap, that was awesome. Yes. Okay, let me heal her. Bam, done, right?" And it it was this ability to be curious, and to be open, like you just said. And it's not even the modern church. I mean, I guess historically it's still, you would call it the modern church, but I can remember the same things growing up as a kid, man. Like it was, you weren't supposed, like, I can remember the illustrations of like the bullseye. Did you all get those things where it was like, these are the, your friends on the outside, they're just kind of whatever, but
Mhm.
as that you get closer,
Hmm.
they need to be certain kinds of Christians, and by the time you get to there, they need to be like the super committed ones that are going to pull you up rather than getting pulled down, that
Yep.
language. So everything you're saying, like you just said, inverts. It's a change, it's a flip, from off to on.
Mhm.
Well, part of what happens, right, when you're kind of go back to what you were talking about a little bit ago, if if you're walking around afraid that this truth you have or who you are is going to be contaminated, the reality is it has been. And so what you're going to do is make sure nobody
Mhm.
else sees the way you've been contaminated. You're going to work really hard on that image management. And
Mhm.
so then this is why churches become some of the least safe places on earth, because we all have to pretend we are something we're not.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, none of us are the perfect Christians. None of us, believe wholly. None of us fully belong to the extent that we want to be, because none of us are these images we're actually presenting. And instead of that being a place of vulnerability and connection where we can kind of come together and recognize that, and then actually face the ways that we aren't these perfect images of ourselves, we end up pushing out anybody that actually lets the cracks through and starts asking. And, words like deconstruction become like bad words as opposed to like, great, that's called mature faith. It's called asking questions, like,
Mhm.
because we shouldn't be afraid of things.
Mhm.
Mm.
But we are, and I want to like recognize, like I think we found as we were writing the book, as we're working on it, we're working through, and the book is sort of divided up into sections. So the first three chapters outline the concept, and then we spend two chapters each on truth, and then life, and then way. Sort of the Jesus identifying as the way, the truth, and the life. And as we're working through those later chapters and kind of really thinking about it and pouring into it and studying and so forth, we found so much value in the Christian tradition, in the Christian sort of Orthodox belief that life lies on the other side of death. Because one of the things that just stands out so much when you start thinking about this, is the fact that the death of the ego is necessary for the health of the person, right?
Mm.
Until we are willing to let our current ego die, right? Our current image of ourselves, that has to be able to be contaminated. We have to let that die in order to move to health. As long as we are invested in keeping that thing alive, we will never be willing to actually encounter or even ourselves, much less God, much less anybody else. We can't even encounter ourselves fully so long as we are holding on to this. We need ourselves to be a particular way. We need the image of ourselves to hold up in a particular way. And I think we were talking earlier about the ways that toxic forms of masculinity don't let men imagine themselves anything but this very narrow way of being a man, or that Christians, evangelical Christians, or most forms of Christians, probably most religions, right, like have these very strict limitations on a way that the person is allowed to imagine themselves and also present to the world. And of course, that way that there's that space, right? There's that space between the way that you kind of are aware that you are. Sometimes you don't want to think about it, but you're aware of who you are. And then there's the version of yourself that you're willing to put out into the world. And there's some space there, and there's a lot of tension in that space, especially when you go to church, as Paul was just saying, right? Because you have to keep, especially that second vision, that version of yourself that you're performing for the world. You have to keep that one up to snuff. And we play so many games with it, right? I mean, I remember a time being, I remember being in those spaces, and you play so many games because one of the things about that projected image of self is that person has to be humble. That person has to admit that they have some sin. So you have to choose the right sins that you can confess to everybody else that won't get you categorized out of camp, that actually reinforce your belonging because they are non-threatening to our identity, but in fact, they're necessary to being part of, like, oh gosh, I'm just another regular Christian. I struggle with, like, and then you'll be like, cussing, right? Like you can really well up. I remember playing this game of like letting, for me it was my queerness, right? And this is before I'm affirming and everything, right? And I'm letting it well up and I'm feeling really convicted about it. And I'm like, and I'm wrestling with it and I'm having lots of pain around this. And then I have to confess something to like my youth group. And so, I'd be like, I watched an R-rated movie the other day, right? And there's all the emotion of like, I am a closeted trans woman behind like, I watched an R-rated movie. And all that does is it's perfect for this stupid game that is keeping us trapped. Because what that does is it tells everybody else, look, this person feels so much guilt around what I think of as a minor sin. I guess that's how we all have to behave. I guess that's the game we have to play. She must be really holy, actually, because she feels she's a very sensitive, it's very sensitive to sin. And we're all playing this game. Anyway, sorry. I rabbit
No.
trailed.
Think back. Just yes. So much of that game that's played. And there are certain sins that you can confess and that you get that cathartic like pat on the back of like, yes, me too, or whatever. But like, boy, there's always a line and you
Hmm.
don't want to get close to it because then it's like, okay, now it's going to get uncomfortable. And that's when you get called into the pastor's office.
You were talking about Shiny Happy People 2 having just come out, and I was thinking I've only watched the first episode. I've
I
read two.
haven't watched a single minute of it. I've been warned. I don't
It,
know.
it it's rough.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know.
But there's a moment in that first episode where they're doing this like it was just such representative like late 90s teen youth group moment where like kids are bashing their secular music CDs and tapes and like pulling their tapes apart, right? And but this is exactly the kind of like catharsis, like this is the disgust expulsion catharsis that we're talking about, right? It's that, I mean, it was brilliant, if evil, of right, like of Ron Luce to come up with this, right? Because what it does is it allows this group to expel something and feel pure, right? It's brilliantly designed to take something that most of these teens had in their homes, give them an opportunity to confess, feel that they're made different, feel that Acquire the Fire or whatever has like given them the opportunity to live into this new life. It protects their ego and it allows them to perform this disgust ritual, and therefore feel better without making like they're not you're not actually making significant changes in your life. How many of us? I remember I can lament like I have a box of comic books that I once threw into a dumpster out of like exactly in an ecstasy of that kind of moment. And like my
Mhm.
gosh, I wish I had those comic books back.
I bur
And
I burned all my Metallica CDs.
right, right. And it's like I wish I had those back. And like how long did it
Yes,
take before I had secular music in my life again? Like
I know.
20 minutes.
Well, let's play what if real fast. All right. Let's play what if.
Mhm.
What if there's a church? Let's just create a church that really participates in this Eucontamination, right? They flipped it all. They're curious, they're open. They're not holding the football. They're like you, Paul, you said their posture has changed, right? So let's say there's another movement of things like that taking place, right? Uh, what does a response by a person following Jesus that's participating in this way of love of Eucontamination, what does that look like practically?
Like in that kind of community
Yeah,
or
yeah, because that's what we're talking about. It's what's out there right now, and it's still being played. It's just not, it looks different, right? Like Billy, I think you said it. It just got different clothes. So I'm just curious from your, hypothetical, just in your head, if there were this church full of these people that were actually living out the things that you all lined out in your book, what is their response to these kinds of things?
yeah, that's a it's a good question. I think my first thought goes to it would be a church that would probably feel really funny to go to because there wouldn't be a sense of um, like dress code or sort of like uniform external view of like, oh, this is who we are. Because what would hold the church community isn't because we all look this way, because we all act this way, because we all do this thing. There would be I think the draw would be Jesus in the middle. It'd be a church that actually is like it was in the term sort of like a centered set church as opposed to a bounded set church, where the goal is how do we move closer towards Jesus, and a Jesus that is that's connected to an active Holy Spirit who disturbs us, who kind of pushes on us. It'd be a church where confession would be pretty active. It'd be a church that we think, in the book we argue for the importance of a lot of old church liturgy, like the Eucharist and baptism and sort of these kind of traditional church aspects. So we think, imagine that like a Sunday service on one hand would look pretty normal, depending on your tradition, but on the other hand, the interactions with the people there wouldn't be one of how do I make sure I belong here.
Mm.
It would be one of acceptance. Instead of having to prove your belonging or fight for your belonging or fear about losing your belonging, it would be one about like, you're here because we're all really excited about what Jesus has done and about what's happening in our lives. Um, and in that sense, like I almost imagine it being, less about this sort of, again, idea of like, what do you believe? Here's the 10 things that you have to believe and ascribe to, sign on the dotted line. And like, that's what we hold to. And it'll be a church that is drawn together because of a passion for Jesus. And that's going to look really different in a lot of different people's lives, which I admit is going to be a harder church to have a like cohesive, like uniform sense of self. And so it's probably going to be a lot messier and it's going to be unique to its context. It's going to look
Mhm.
different in Seattle and the way the culture in Seattle is formed and the way people here are formed, then it's going to look in Baltimore, then it's going to look in Florida.
Mhm.
Would
And I
you
want
add
to
to that?
say, I think some things that stand out to me as I think about a church like that. One is I think that somebody who visited that church would feel weird, but probably in a good way, because they would be received by people who are excited that there is somebody else there with the sense that this person has something to contribute. This person has brought in something we haven't had up until now. We don't know what it is yet. We're excited you're here. Not so, as I think often when we visit churches, there's a sense of like, oh, you're here. How can we bless you? Right? That's the kind of form of hospitality that we are used to churches trying to sort of advertise, as opposed to you're here. What a blessing to us. A new perspective is now among us, and we're excited that we get that, right? And it would be a genuine, this would not be something trumped up. It would just be a genuine excitement that there are now somebody with new sets of perspectives and life experiences and so forth is here among us now. And so we want to know what they have to say. We want to know what they think. I mean, try to hold back from being like overwhelming or something, but that would be a real sense of difference, I think. The other thing you had asked is, how would that church deal with the next thing that comes along, this next wave of things that come along. And I want to say that I think the first impulse of a church like that, of a eucontaminating church that is sort of Jesus centered, the first question they would be inclined to ask is, who is being blamed? Right? Rather than, is this a threat to us? Are we are we under threat? Is this something we should be concerned about? Is it not something we should be concerned about? It's who is being blamed here? And there would be what we would call a hermeneutic of suspicion in the theological circles towards that kind of, when you see a mass movement that is blaming something, there would be this sort of automatic suspicion of towards the evilness, like the purported evilness or threat of that thing. And there'd be curiosity around, well, what does that thing have to offer? Why are they experiencing it as such a threat? Why is it being framed as such a threat? And it could be that it is something harmful, or it could be that it is not, right? But a eucontaminated and eucontaminating church would be one that is going to greet something new with curiosity and openness first, and therefore actually be able to hold on to its capacity to reason a lot longer than a church that is shaped by that over-applied purity metaphor and sees anything as a potential threat, and therefore you need to get rid of it first, and then you're going to inevitably tell yourself a story about why getting rid of it, ejecting it, refusing it was the right thing to do.
That's interesting. Uh, so, um, I think that dovetails into like my next question that I wanted to ask y'all really well, because it's the posture of, like you said, like being curious, being open to, this new thing that's coming in, rather than being scared of this new thing. Why are we scared? We're the spit. Like we're the poop. What's going to hurt us, right?
Mhm.
Um, which I'm gonna say that so many times going forward, and people are like, "What are you talking about?" Um, uh, my wife's gonna be like, "What are you, 12?" Yes,
Yeah,
yes, I am.
that's
But
in there
you,
too. That's this back of the ego here.
uh-huh, yes. But you end the book with a dare to keep asking, what if there's more, right? What if there's more? And I love that, by the way. So my question for you both is, what's something you're still wrestling with or being undone by?
That's a good question.
Oh, I'd say there's a there's a lot there, and how personal we want to get here. I mean, we end the book partly by recognizing like one of the benefits of writing with my sibling is that I get to know my sibling better and we get to work together and we have this shared background and there's a lot from our lives that we can pull up. One of the limitations is we have a shared background and there's a lot that we can pull up from our shared background, which means it's just our perspective. And so we tried to end that last chapter with an acknowledgement of like, hey, here's our social location. Like, here's where we were raised. Here are the ways we were formed, which means there's just countless other ways that we weren't formed. There's so many experiences we haven't had, which means I don't even have the capacity to imagine, Joe, what this might look like for you to take it. And so, one of the ways I've enjoyed being undone is as kind of our work has gotten out there, is hearing other people take it and go in really wild directions with it. So, like a colleague of mine at the school where I teach, she has a background in fermentation and like working at wineries, and so she's done all this stuff with bacteria. And so she heard about it and went directly to food and fermentation and the way like cheeses are made and different wines are made, and sort of took it in this really cool direction and started talking about wild magic versus white magic, and it was just a really fascinating direction. I would have absolutely no way of doing that. And so some of the ways I've been undone has been seeing how people with different backgrounds and different ways of viewing the world and different skill sets and all these other aspects have been able to take this idea and then just feed it back to me and give me whole new ways of thinking.
Mhm.
On a personal side, I am constantly wrestling with the fact that I'm a therapist and that I work in higher education, and some of the ways that those are systems that hurt people.
Mm.
And so, like, I continue to wrestle, like as somebody, I attend a church at this time, and I wrestle with like what is the role of the church these days, and what is the role of higher education, in our current political setup, in our current economic structure, the problems with mental health counseling and how that kind of forecloses help to so many, but offers help to just the rich, right? There's a lot of ways that I would say on a personal level, I'm wrestling with that, and looking for more ways to not just push away from these systems that I think are problematic, as if I could somehow like distance myself from them and stay perfect, but instead perhaps to try to be a eucontaminate within them to say, hey, what are ways we can actually contaminate these systems so that in all the problems of higher education, we can actually like subvert it to do a bit more than it has been doing.
Yeah. I like that, Paul. I would say so. Again, situating myself as as a queer Christian woman, as a trans woman in America in 1920, in 2019, in 2025, um, there's a lot to be afraid of right now. And there is a lot to potentially use disgust against, right? I often find, especially when I'm like engaging on social media or engaging, just out in the world with the regular people, the people that you might run across that you don't know that you're going to run across. But when I'm engaging in the world, disgust is this weapon that I keep having to choose not to pick up, right? And especially disgust towards other people. And again, that's not there are places where disgust can be appropriate, and that's not to say that everybody is safe for me. And in fact, I have to make wise and informed decisions about what spaces are and are not safe for me. But I will say that one thing, especially again speaking as a trans woman, there's this temptation to center my experience because of the fear, right? Like there's this sense of, in order to keep myself safe, I have to make everybody aware of the threats to me and people like me. And the corollary temptation to that, I don't think that's wrong necessarily, but the corollary temptation to that is to downplay threats to anybody else, right? And so what I find where the challenge I think lies for me right now, and where I'm wrestling and trying to grow and hoping to grow, is in being open to seeing and valuing the experiences, including the experiences of threat that people not like me are also facing. Right. If I tell myself I post about trans people a lot, but if I'm not posting about the threats that are being posed to my immigrant neighbors right now, I am missing out. If I'm not paying attention to the threats that are currently being leveled against my disabled friends right now, I am not I am not open to being you contaminated by their pain, by their legitimate fear, right? And I need to hold that in front of myself moving forward.
Mm, that's tough.
Mm.
That's tough. That's tough right now. That's
Mhm.
tough right now. Well, let me ask you this. Let's land the plane right here. This is what I want to ask both of you, and I'm interested because of your different perspectives of life, different, you literally all the way across the country from one another, but having this shared experience. I'm curious for those people that would be listening, or maybe they'll see this clip, right? Maybe they haven't listened to this, but they'll see this clip, that have been labeled disgusting by either the church or like the political extension of the American church. What word of hope or liberation would you want to speak directly to them?
You want to go first, Billy?
Sure. I want to ask you to see that labeling as a recognition on the one hand of your power and of your goodness. So first, the idea that you are not worthy of community, that you need to be expelled from the community for the community to be healthy, is 100% wrong, because who you are is beautiful and right and good. And on the other half of that, the reason that they are spreading that lie is because they have accurately seen the power of transformation that you will bring to their broken community, that loving you is in fact an act that would transform them into something more like God. And it is the part in them that is resisting transformation into beings and persons and communities that more fully participate in the divine. It's the part of them that resists that has labeled you disgusting. That's what I have to say for that.
Paul, you should have gone first.
I don't know how to follow that up, other than perhaps an amen. And I think maybe just a reminder that when someone is labeled disgusting, that says much more about the labeler than it does the one who is labeled. And the one who will label you disgusting are themselves acting out their disgust. And it says much more about who they are than it does about who you are. And as somebody who identifies in so many ways in those groups of people that label everybody else disgusting because they aren't like me, I'm just so sorry.
I feel that. I do. I feel that. Thank you both. Billie, Paul, such a great, I want to honor your time. I have so many more questions and so many different directions that I wanted to go. I literally could talk to both of you for another few hours and probably still not cover everything. But I just wanted to thank you both. When does the book come out?
So we're recording this on August 1st, a little behind the scenes there. It came out today. So the book is out now.
Oh, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah. Right? So
right now.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And I was going to say, we were talking, did I see that you're going to do this show?
Say it again. I'm sorry. You broke up.
Did I see that you're going to be a Wild Goose in North Carolina?
I was going to. It's not going to work. I was so there. I was going to do a thing, and I can't make it now. It's a whole thing. But yeah, I'm going to miss it. I'm so bummed.
We will have to catch up again some other time, though.
Yes, we definitely will. Yeah. Well, if so, then that means that anybody can order it right now from Amazon. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Billie, I know that you're on social media, and so we'll put the links on there. Paul, is that something that you really kind of delve into at all?
I don't do a lot of social media outside of, I have a Substack where I post small little thought pieces and other places whenever we're on podcasts, or I publish articles and things like that. So
all right. All of that will be in the show notes. So if you're listening, following along, go to the show notes and you can find all of those things so that you can dive into this even more, and all of the other things that y'all are doing. So, but just again, thank you so much, not only for this time, but for your work. And I used the words before, but the hope and the liberation that this is going to bring to so many people. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for following along, everybody. Go check those show notes. I hope that wherever you find yourself today, that you are having the exact day that you need. Now get out of here. Go love on some people.